Grace Whitmore froze with a jug of ale halfway to the table, because the words she had just heard did not match anything she was supposed to understand. The two merchants sitting in the corner of the Gilded Anchor were speaking Arabic, low and quick, their heads bent close together over a folded paper. They believed no one in this small English port town could follow a single word. Most people could not. But Grace's grandfather, Samuel Whitmore, had spent 30 years loading and unloading ships from Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, and before he died he had taught his granddaughter the language the way other grandfathers teach fishing or carpentry. Quietly. Patiently, every evening after supper for years, until the words settled into her like a second skin. She had never told anyone at the tavern. It had never mattered before. It mattered now. "He will not know the difference," one of the merchants said, tapping the paper with a thick finger. "The interpreter has already agreed on his price. Whatever we write here, he will tell the Englishman something else. Something the Englishman wants to hear." The second merchant, older, with a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw, glanced nervously toward the tavern door. "And if the Duke discovers it later? By then the contract will be signed. Land will be ours. Ships will be loading. What can an English duke do about ink that is already dry?" Grace kept walking, her feet moving on their own while her mind spun. She set the jug down at the next table without remembering how she got there. Her hands were not shaking, not yet, but her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain the whole room could hear it. The Duke, they meant the man upstairs. The man who had ridden into town 3 days ago with a dozen guards, 4 wagons, and a translator who never left his side. Duke Edmund Castleton had come a long way to sign a trade agreement that people in town had been talking about for weeks. Grain, wool, and iron would travel south. Silk, spices, and rare dyes would travel north. The innkeeper, Walter Higgins, had told anyone who would listen that this single agreement could make the whole town rich, could bring new roads, new business, new life to a place that had been quietly shrinking for a decade. And now 2 merchants in the corner of Walter's own tavern were talking about cheating that very Duke out of land, using lies dressed up as translation. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and tried to look like a woman who had heard nothing more interesting than the weather. She moved behind the bar, poured a drink she didn't need to pour, and watched the door to the private dining room, where she knew the Duke's translator had been eating alone not 20 minutes earlier. His name was Nathaniel Vale. He was tall, well-dressed, always smiling in a way that never quite reached his eyes. He had arrived with the Duke's party as the official interpreter, the man trusted to carry every word between 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 futures. Grace had served him wine on his first night in town and noticed something odd even then. He ordered his food in careful, formal English, but once, when a merchant servant asked him a quick question in Arabic in the hallway, Vale had answered back too fast, too fluent, then caught himself and slowed down, as if he had suddenly remembered he was supposed to be struggling with the language in front of others. At the time she had thought nothing of it. People are strange, travelers are stranger. Now the memory sat differently in her mind, heavy and cold. She glanced again at the 2 merchants. They had folded the paper away and were speaking normally now, laughing about something unrelated, men who knew how to hide a secret in plain sight. She wondered how many other conversations like this one had happened in this tavern over the past 3 days, right under everyone's nose, while she carried plates and poured drinks and thought about nothing more than getting through her shift. A bell rang from the kitchen. Walter needed her. Grace forced her feet to move, forced her face into its usual pleasant shape, and spent the rest of the evening serving food she could not taste and pouring drinks she barely saw, her mind circling the same terrible question over and over. What was she supposed to do with what she knew? She was nobody, a tavern maid with rough hands and a patched dress, the daughter of a dead dockworker, a woman who had never spoken to anyone more important than the town constable. The Duke upstairs had guards, advisors, a household full of educated men who had studied politics and law their whole lives. Surely one of them would notice if something was wrong. Surely it was not her place to interfere in matters far above her station. But then she thought of the merchant's voice, calm and confident, saying the words that would not leave her alone. He will not know the difference. By then the contract will be signed. If she said nothing, and the deal went through built on lies, the whole town would suffer for it eventually. Land given away under false terms. Trust broken between two peoples who had traveled a long way to build something honest. And somewhere in the middle of it, a duke who trusted the wrong man completely, walking toward a mistake he did not even know he was making. Grace served the last table of the night and climbed the narrow stairs to her small room above the kitchen. But she did not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the lantern light flicker in the hallway outside the Duke's chambers, and turned the problem over and over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. 2 days. The signing was 2 days away. 2 days to decide whether a tavern maid with no name and no power was going to walk up to a duke and tell him that the man he trusted most in this town was lying to his face. She thought of her grandfather then, the way he used to say that knowing something and doing nothing with it was its own kind of lie. He had taught her the language for reasons she never fully understood while he was alive. Perhaps, she thought now, staring into the dark, this was the reason. Perhaps some skills wait years in silence for the one moment they are needed. Below her window, footsteps crossed the courtyard. She looked down and saw Nathaniel Vale walking briskly toward the stables, glancing over his shoulder twice before disappearing into the shadows near the back gate, where she realized with a fresh jolt of unease, the 2 merchants from the corner table were already waiting. Grace pressed herself back from the window, her breath caught in her throat. Whatever was happening in this town, it was bigger than a single conversation overheard by accident, and there were only 2 days left before it became impossible to stop. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake listening to every creak of the old building, every distant voice, every set of footsteps on the stairs, turning the same question over in her mind until the first gray light of morning finally crept through the window. Somehow, before the sun rose fully over the rooftops of the town, she was going to have to find a way to make someone listen to her. The only question left was how. At dawn, Grace splashed cold water on her face and finally made a decision she could not undo. She would try the proper way first. If that failed, she would think of something else. She found her chance an hour later, when Roland Pike, the Duke's steward, came down to the tavern's common room to arrange breakfast for the household. He was a narrow man with a tidy mustache and the permanent expression of someone who believed most problems were beneath his attention. Grace had served him twice already and knew he liked his eggs plain and his conversations short. "Sir," she said quietly, setting a plate in front of him, "might I have a word about the trade agreement?" Roland did not look up from the papers he was reading. The trade agreement is not the business of tavern staff. I believe there may be a problem with the translation. That made him look up, though only briefly, and only with the mild irritation of a man swatting at a fly. The translator was chosen personally by the Duke's council. He comes with excellent references from 3 previous negotiations. I hardly think a serving girl would know better than trained diplomats. I only wish to mention what I overheard. "Girl," Roland said, setting down his fork with a small, precise click, "the Duke has spent months preparing for this agreement. He does not need rumors from the kitchen the day before he signs it. If you have concerns about the ale, take them to Master Higgins. If you have concerns about diplomacy, keep them to yourself." He returned to his eggs, and the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was finished. Grace walked away with her face burning, humiliation curling hot in her stomach. She had expected some resistance, some skepticism, but the flat dismissal stung more than she had prepared for. She busied herself with other tables for the rest of the morning, refilling cups, clearing plates, all the while turning the failed conversation over in her mind, looking for what she should have said differently, what proof she could have offered that a man like Roland Pike would have taken seriously. The truth was, she had no proof, only 2 overheard sentences and a strange late-night meeting by the stables. To a man who trusted paperwork and references, that would never be enough. By midday, the tavern was busier than usual. filled with merchants and travelers who had come to town for the signing. Grace watched them from behind the bar, trying to guess which of them might know something, might have heard something, might be willing to help a stranger they had no reason to trust. It was during the lunch rush that she noticed something odd. Nathaniel Vale entered the tavern alone, sat at a corner table, and ordered wine in his usual formal English. Minutes later, one of the two merchants from the previous night's conversation slipped in through the side door and joined him, sitting close, speaking low. Grace took her time carrying a tray past their table, straining every muscle in her body to appear unhurried and uninterested, while her ears worked as hard as they had ever worked in her life. "The numbers must match what I tell the Duke," Vale was saying, his voice a careful whisper. "Not what is written on the copy you keep. If he ever asks to see it read aloud, I control what is read." "And the land near the river," the merchant said. "That was not part of the original terms." "It is now. He will hear river access. He will not hear river ownership. There is a difference, and only I will know it." Grace's hands tightened around her tray so hard her knuckles went pale. This was worse than she had first believed. It was not a simple misunderstanding or an honest mistake in translation. This was planned, deliberate, built layer by layer to hide a theft of land behind pleasant-sounding words, and Vale was not acting alone. Someone on the merchant's side wanted this deceit as badly as he did. She delivered her tray to the next table and retreated to the kitchen, where she stood gripping the edge of the wash basin, breathing hard, trying to steady herself. Walter Higgins glanced over from the stove. "You look like you've seen a ghost, girl." "I'm well," she managed, "just warm from the crowd." He did not press her further, and she was grateful, because she did not trust her voice to hold steady through an explanation. Instead, she splashed water on her wrists and forced herself back out into the common room, back to the endless rhythm of serving and clearing, all while her mind raced ahead to the next problem. Roland Pike would not listen to her. That door was closed. But the steward was not the only person in the Duke's household. There were guards, there were other advisors, and there was, somewhere above her in the private rooms of the tavern, the Duke himself, a man she had glimpsed only twice, tall and serious, with the tired eyes of someone carrying more responsibility than any one person should have to carry alone. She did not know him. She had no connections to his household, no letters of introduction, no family name that would open doors. All she had was the truth, and the growing certainty that no one with proper standing was going to listen to a tavern maid's warning without proof she did not have. That evening, after the dinner crowd had thinned and the fires had burned low, Grace slipped out to the stable yard on the pretense of fetching water. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of hay and horses and distant wood smoke. She stood near the well, pretending to draw water, watching the shadows near the back gate where she had seen Vale and the merchants meet the night before. Tonight no one came. She waited longer than she should have, long enough that Walter would surely notice her absence, and was about to give up and return inside when she heard a door creak open behind her. She turned, heart leaping into her throat, and found herself face to face not with Vale, but with a boy no older than 14, dressed in the plain gray livery of the Duke's household staff. "You're the girl who spoke to Master Pike this morning," the boy said, glancing nervously toward the tavern. "About the translator." Grace's breath caught. "How do you know that?" "I was in the room, fetching linens. He mentioned it to another servant afterward, laughed about it actually. Said a serving girl thought she knew better than the Duke's own counsel." Grace felt her face flush again, but she pushed the humiliation aside. "Did you believe him, that I was wrong?" The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder once more before stepping closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you heard, but I've noticed things too, small things. The translator asks to review documents alone before presenting them to the Duke. He always insists on being the only one in the room during the private reading of terms. My master trusts him completely, and no one questions it, because no one else in the household speaks Arabic well enough to check his work." Grace's pulse quickened. "What is your name?" Peter, I serve in the Duke's traveling household, mostly errands and messages. Peter, I need to speak with the Duke directly, not the steward, not another servant, the Duke himself, before the signing tomorrow. Peter's eyes widened. That's not possible. No one gets an audience without going through Master Pike first, and you've already seen how that went. Then I need another way in. The boy chewed his lip, thinking, the nervous energy of someone caught between loyalty to his household and a growing unease about what he had noticed himself. Finally, he spoke. The Duke takes a walk most evenings alone before he retires. Just around the tavern gardens, no guards close by because he says he needs a moment without eyes on him all day. He'll be out within the hour if his habits hold. That might be your only chance. Grace's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and fierce, sudden hope. Thank you, Peter. Don't thank me yet, the boy said quietly. If Master Pike learns I told you this, I'll lose my position, maybe worse. And if you're wrong about all this, you'll have accused the Duke's most trusted man of lying, in front of the Duke himself, the night before the most important agreement of his career. There won't be a second chance if that goes badly. Grace understood the weight of what he was saying. This was not a small risk. It was, quite possibly, the only chance she would get, and if she used it badly, or if the Duke refused to believe her, everything that came after would be built on a lie that no one but her and a nervous house boy even suspected. She thanked him again, watched him hurry back inside before anyone noticed his absence, and turned to face the dark garden path where, within the hour, a Duke would walk alone, unaware that the biggest decision of his career was about to collide with the quiet courage of a woman he had never met. The well water in her bucket had long gone still and cold, forgotten in her hand. She set it down carefully, wiped her palms against her apron one final time, and began walking toward the garden gate, rehearsing in her mind the words she would need to say, knowing that whatever happened next, there was no going back from this moment. Somewhere above the tavern, candlelight flickered in a window she now knew belonged to Nathaniel Vale, still awake, still working, still weaving his careful, dangerous lies into the fabric of tomorrow's agreement. She had perhaps 1 hour left to stop him. The garden behind the gilded anchor was small, bordered by a low stone wall and a scattering of apple trees that had gone wild years before anyone thought to prune them. Grace had walked past this garden 100 times without truly seeing it. Tonight every shadow between the trees seemed to hold its breath. She waited near the gate, arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill, watching the tavern's side door. Minutes crawled by. She began to wonder if Peter had been wrong, if the Duke's habits had changed, if she would stand here all night for nothing while the hour of her only chance slipped away unused. Then the door opened, and a tall figure stepped out into the dim light, alone, exactly as the boy had promised. Duke Edmund Castleton walked with the measured pace of a man who carried his burdens quietly. He wore a plain dark coat instead of the formal clothing she had seen him in before, and without his guards and advisors surrounding him, he looked less like a symbol of power and more like an ordinary man, tired, thoughtful, in need of a moment's peace before another difficult day. Grace's courage nearly failed her completely. Every instinct told her to slip back into the shadows and let him pass, to abandon this reckless plan and return to her quiet, safe life pouring ale and clearing plates. But she thought of the merchant's voice again, calm and certain. By then the contract will be signed, and she thought of Peter's warning that there would be no second chance. She stepped out from beside the gate, directly into his path. The Duke stopped short, startled, his hand moving instinctively toward the hilt of the short blade he wore even in the garden. "Who goes there?" "Forgive me, my lord," Grace said quickly, dropping into a hurried curtsy, her voice shaking despite every effort to steady it. "I am Grace Whitmore. I work here at the tavern. I would not dare approach you like this if it were not urgent." He studied her for a long moment, his hand relaxing slightly from his blade, though his expression remained guarded. "It is late for tavern business, and this is not the place for it." "It is not tavern business, my lord. It concerns your translator." Something shifted in his face, a flicker of attention where before there had been only polite dismissal. Nathaniel Vale. Yes, my lord. And what precisely would a serving girl know about my translator that my own household does not? Grace's heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it across the small distance between them. This was the moment. There would be no rehearsing it a second time. My lord, I speak Arabic. My grandfather taught me, years ago when I was young. Last night, and again today, I overheard conversations between your translator and the merchants he is meant to be working alongside. What he tells you and what is actually being said are not the same thing. The Duke's face went very still. That is a serious accusation. I know, my lord. Vale came to me with excellent recommendations. 3 prior negotiations, all successful, all praised by the councils involved. Why would he risk everything now, in the middle of the most important agreement of his career, to deceive me? I don't know his reasons, my lord. I only know what I heard. Tell me exactly. Grace repeated, as precisely as her memory allowed, every phrase from both conversations. The talk of river ownership disguised as river access. The promise that only Vale would know the difference between the copy read aloud and the copy the merchants kept for themselves. The careless confidence of men who believed no one around them could understand their own language. She spoke quickly at first, then more slowly as she saw the Duke's expression change from skepticism to something colder and more focused, the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the days ahead. When she finished, silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of the town settling into night. You understand, the Duke said finally, that if you are wrong or if you are lying, the consequences for you will be severe. Accusing a man of my own household of deceit, on the eve of a signing this important, is not something I can treat lightly in either direction. I understand, my lord. I would not have come to you if I were not certain of what I heard. And if you are right, he continued almost to himself, then I have spent months building an agreement on a foundation that was never solid to begin with, trusting a man who has been laughing behind my back the entire time. His jaw tightened. How do I know you are not simply mistaken? Arabic is a rich language. A single word can carry many meanings depending on context, tone, the relationship between speakers. Perhaps you misunderstood something innocent. Grace had expected this question, had turned it over in her mind through the long, sleepless hours of the previous night. My lord, I cannot prove to you tonight, standing in this garden, that I am correct, but I can tell you this. Tomorrow, when the terms are read aloud during the signing, ask someone else, someone Vale does not know is present, to listen alongside him, someone who also understands Arabic. If what is spoken aloud in your hearing matches what is written on the merchant's copy, then I am wrong, and you may deal with me however you see fit. But if it does not match, you will have your proof before the ink is ever dry. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. Finally, he spoke. Where would I find such a person on such short notice? Someone with the language and with no connection to either party, whose word I could trust completely. Grace hesitated. This was the piece of the plan she had not fully worked out, the gap in her hurried scheme that she had hoped, somehow, would resolve itself. I don't know, my lord. I only know it cannot be me standing beside you tomorrow. Vale knows my face. He would grow suspicious the moment he saw me near the signing hall, and whatever plan he has for tomorrow, he would find a way to change it before anyone could catch him. You have thought this through further than I expected from someone who claims to have stumbled into this by accident. I have had a very long night to think, my lord. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face, there and gone in an instant. There is a monastery 2 hours from here, on the northern road. I have heard the brothers there include scholars who studied in the East, men fluent in several languages, including Arabic. If I send a writer tonight, with enough urgency and enough silver, one of them might reach us before the signing begins tomorrow afternoon. That would work, my lord, if he can be trusted to keep the reason for his visit quiet until the moment it matters. Trust, the Duke repeated softly, almost bitterly, is precisely the thing I am now questioning in every direction. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, a grudging respect creeping in beneath the caution. You risked a great deal coming to me like this. My steward already dismissed you once today, I am told. Grace's cheeks warmed. You heard about that, my lord. Roland reports everything to me, even things he considers beneath notice. He mentioned a tavern girl with wild claims about the translation. I confess I did not think much of it at the time. I am reconsidering that now. I only wanted someone to listen, my lord. I am listening. He straightened, some of the weariness in his posture replaced by a new, sharper alertness, the look of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was less solid than he believed. Tell no one else what you told me tonight. Not Master Higgins, not the other servants, no one. If Vale suspects for even a moment that someone has spoken against him, he may find a way to disappear before tomorrow's signing, taking whatever proof exists with him, or worse, taking steps to silence whoever he believes has betrayed his secret. The warning sent a cold thread of fear through Grace's chest, a fear she had not fully allowed herself to feel until this exact moment, standing in the dark garden with the full weight of what she had started finally settling over her. I understand, my lord. Good. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read. What made you come to me at all? You could have said nothing. No one would have known you overheard anything. Whatever happens with this agreement, good or bad, it would never have touched you directly. Grace thought of her grandfather, of the quiet evenings spent learning a language she never expected to need, of his voice telling her that knowing something and doing nothing with it was its own kind of lie. She thought of the town below the tavern windows, the families who depended on honest trade, the strangers who had traveled so far to build something that was now, without their knowledge, rotting from the inside. Because I could understand what they were saying, my lord, and no one else could. If I said nothing, I would be the only person able to stop this, and I would have chosen not to. The Duke studied her a moment longer, then nodded once, a small, formal gesture that carried more weight than any words could have. Return to your work as though tonight never happened. I will send my rider within the hour. Whatever tomorrow brings, Grace Whitmore, know that you did what very few people in your position would have dared to do. He turned and walked back toward the tavern, his figure disappearing into the shadows near the door, leaving Grace alone in the cold garden with her heart still racing, and a single, overwhelming thought circling through her mind. Tomorrow, everything would either be proven true, or she would have destroyed her own life over nothing at all. She did not know, as she made her way back inside past the sleeping common room and up the narrow stairs to her small chamber, that Nathaniel Vale's window candle had gone dark only minutes before, or that a shadow near the stable had shifted at the sound of voices in the garden, watching, listening, wondering exactly how much of the conversation had carried on the night air. Grace woke before dawn to the sound of hooves on the cobblestones outside, sharp and urgent in the still morning air. She rose quickly, dressed, and made her way down to the common room, where Walter Higgins was already stoking the fire, grumbling about riders who left before proper breakfast could be prepared. Duke's man, he muttered, not looking up from the flames. Left before sunrise, riding hard toward the north road. Strange business, all this coming and going before such an important day. Grace said nothing, though her stomach twisted with a mixture of relief and fresh anxiety. The rider was on his way to the monastery, exactly as the Duke had promised. If the roads were kind and the brothers there were willing, there might be a scholar in town before the signing, someone with no loyalty to either side, someone who could confirm or destroy everything she had risked the night before. She threw herself into her morning duties with unusual focus, grateful for the mindless rhythm of carrying trays and wiping tables, anything to keep her thoughts from circling endlessly toward the hours ahead. But her carefully built calm shattered the moment Nathaniel Vale walked into the common room for his breakfast. He looked at first glance exactly as he always did, composed and pleasant, offering polite greetings to the other guests as he took his usual table by the window. But when Grace approached to take his order, something in his eyes made her steps falter. He was watching her too closely, his smile a fraction too fixed, the warmth in his expression not quite reaching the calculation beneath it. "Good morning," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "You look tired, miss. Did you sleep poorly?" "Well enough, sir," she answered, keeping her voice steady, her eyes on her notepad rather than his face. "What can I bring you?" "Bread and cheese will do." He paused, studying her a moment longer than necessary. "I noticed lights in the garden last night rather late. Were you out walking?" Grace's heart lurched, though she forced her expression to remain pleasant, unbothered. "I was fetching water for the kitchen, sir. The well runs slow after dark." "Of course," he smiled again, but the warmth had thinned considerably. "A tavern maid's work never truly ends, does it? Always some small errand or another at all hours." "No, sir, it does not." She hurried away before he could ask anything further, her hands trembling slightly as she delivered his order to the kitchen. Walter glanced at her, concerned. "You've gone pale, girl. Are you well?" "Just the heat from the fire," she lied, and busied herself with other tables, though her mind raced with a single, chilling thought. Vale had noticed the lights in the garden. He suspected something, even if he did not yet know exactly what. And a man clever enough to build layers of deception into a trade agreement was certainly clever enough to feel the ground shifting beneath him, even before he understood why. The morning stretched on, tense and strange, every ordinary sound taking on new weight in Grace's ears. She caught glimpses of Roland Pike moving briskly between rooms, his expression more harried than usual, and wondered whether the Duke had told his steward anything about the previous night's conversation, or whether he was keeping his suspicions as tightly guarded as he had asked her to keep hers. It was mid-morning when Peter found her in the hallway outside the kitchen, his young face drawn with worry. "You need to be careful," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder before continuing. "Vale asked one of the other servants this morning whether anyone had been near the garden gate last night. He made it sound casual, but Anna said his questions felt sharp, like he already suspected an answer and was only looking for confirmation." Grace's throat tightened. "Does he know it was me?" "I don't think so, not yet, but he's watching everyone more closely today, and he asked something else, something stranger. He wanted to know if any travelers had passed through the tavern gates before dawn, heading north." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. If Vale had somehow learned about the rider, if he suspected the Duke was sending for outside verification, he would know exactly how much time remained before his careful lies unraveled completely. A man cornered that tightly might do anything to protect himself, and Grace had no way of knowing how far he was willing to go. "Peter, does the Duke know Vale is asking these questions?" "I don't know. I haven't been able to get near him all morning. Master Pike has kept the whole household busier than I've ever seen, preparing the signing hall, checking guest lists, arranging the ceremony. It's like nothing unusual happened at all, at least on the surface." Grace nodded slowly, trying to think past the fear tightening in her chest. "Then we simply have to trust that he is handling it. There's nothing more either of us can do except keep our heads down and wait." But waiting, she discovered as the day dragged on, was its own kind of torment. Every time Vale's eyes passed over her, she felt a fresh jolt of dread, certain that this would be the moment he finally connected the pieces, certain that she would look up from clearing a table to find him standing directly in front of her. His pleasant mask finally dropped to reveal whatever lay beneath it. By early afternoon, the tavern had filled with an unusual mix of guests. Merchants arriving early for the signing, curious townsfolk hoping to catch a glimpse of the Duke, and a scattering of travelers passing through who had no idea they had wandered into the middle of something far more dangerous than an ordinary trade negotiation. Grace worked through the crowd mechanically, her senses stretched thin, listening for any word, any sign, any hint of how close the monastery rider might be. It was Walter who finally brought the news, though he had no idea of its true significance. "A monk's arrived," he announced to the room in general, wiping his hands on his apron as he returned from the front entrance. Asking after the Duke's household, strange for a man of the cloth to travel with such urgency. Grace nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. She set it down carefully on the nearest table, murmured an excuse to the confused guests seated there, and made her way toward the entrance as quickly as she dared without drawing attention. Through the front window, she caught a glimpse of a figure in simple brown robes dismounting from a horse lathered with sweat, clearly having ridden hard and fast to arrive before the appointed hour. A member of the Duke's household hurried out to greet him, and within moments the monk was being led inside, disappearing toward the private rooms where, Grace assumed, the Duke was waiting. Relief flooded through her, so sudden and overwhelming that her knees felt momentarily unsteady. The scholar had arrived. Whatever happened now, at least the pieces the Duke needed to test the truth were finally in place. But her relief was short-lived. As she turned back toward the common room, she caught sight of Nathaniel Vale standing near the staircase, perfectly still, watching the same scene she had just witnessed. His face had lost every trace of its usual pleasant composure. For just a moment before he mastered himself and turned away, Grace saw something raw and dangerous flicker across his features, the look of a man who understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what that monk's arrival meant for his carefully constructed plan. He knew. Grace's blood ran cold. Whatever the Duke intended for the signing, however carefully he planned to expose the truth, Vale now had at least a few hours' warning that his deception was about to be tested. And a man with that much to lose, cornered and desperate, was far more dangerous than a man who believed himself safely hidden. She hurried back into the common room, forcing herself to breathe evenly, to keep her hands steady as she resumed her work, all while her mind raced through every possible outcome of the hours ahead. Would Vale try to flee before the signing, abandoning his careful scheme rather than risk exposure? Would he attempt to sabotage the monk's testimony somehow, to discredit him before he could speak? Or would he simply proceed as planned, gambling that his skill and confidence would carry him through even now, betting that no one would truly believe a foreign scholar's word over his own? She did not know. All she could do was wait, and watch, and hope that whatever the Duke had planned would be enough to catch a man who now knew, beyond any doubt, that he was being hunted. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the tavern windows, and somewhere above the common room, in a private chamber she could not see into, a Duke and a monk were beginning a conversation that would determine the fate of an agreement, a translator, and though she barely allowed herself to think it, quite possibly her own future as well. Grace continued her work, outwardly calm, inwardly a storm of nerves, counting down the hours until the signing that would either prove everything she had risked or ruin her completely for daring to speak at all. The monk's name, Grace learned later from Peter, was Brother Aldous, a quiet man in his middle years who had spent nearly a decade studying in Damascus before returning to England to join the monastery on the Northern Road. He was, by every account Peter could gather, exactly the kind of independent, unquestionably neutral witness the Duke needed, a man with no stake in trade agreements, no loyalty to merchants or translators, only a scholar's careful devotion to accuracy and truth. Behind the closed doors of the Duke's private chamber, Brother Aldous listened as Duke Edmund explained, in careful and measured tones, the situation he now found himself in. A serving girl at the tavern claimed to understand Arabic. She claimed to have overheard the Duke's own translator conspiring with merchants to alter the terms of a trade agreement, disguising a theft of land and resources behind carefully chosen words that would sound harmless to English ears, while meaning something entirely different to those who understood the original language. "It is a serious accusation," Brother Aldous said, his voice calm but attentive. "And translation, my lord, is a delicate art. A skilled interpreter can shade meaning in small ways without technically lying, choosing one true word over another, emphasizing one clause while softening another. It is not always simple deceit. Sometimes it is simply the nature of moving thought between languages that were never built to match perfectly." "I understand that," the Duke replied. But what the girl described was not shading of meaning. It was a deliberate substitution. River access spoken aloud, river ownership written on the copy retained by the merchants. That is not a delicate art, brother. That is theft dressed in a scholar's clothing. Brother Aldous considered this for a long moment. If what she says is true, my lord, it is a serious matter indeed, one that could have consequences reaching far beyond this single agreement. Trust between our two peoples, built carefully over years of careful diplomacy, could be damaged badly by a single dishonest man. Which is precisely why I need you tomorrow, seated near enough to hear every word spoken during the reading of terms, without Vale realizing you understand the language at all. If what is spoken aloud matches what is written on both copies of the agreement, then the girl was mistaken, and we proceed as planned. But if there is any discrepancy, however small, I need you to signal me immediately, before a single signature touches the parchment. And how would you have me signal you, my lord, without alerting the translator that anything is amiss? The Duke thought for a moment. A simple gesture, touch the ring on your left hand if all is well. Remove it entirely, set it upon the table before you if it is not. Nothing more dramatic than that. Nothing Vale would think to watch for. Brother Aldous nodded slowly. A reasonable plan, my lord, though I must ask, for my own understanding, why you trust this serving girl's word enough to risk such an elaborate test at all. Surely there were simpler explanations you might have considered first, before disrupting the most important negotiation of your career on a servant's claim. The Duke was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight Grace would never hear directly, though Peter, listening at the edge of the corridor with the particular skill of a boy who had learned to make himself invisible, caught every word and later repeated it to her in careful, hushed detail. Because she had nothing to gain by lying to me, brother, and everything to lose. A servant does not accuse a nobleman's trusted man of deceit for entertainment. She risked her position, her reputation, quite possibly her safety, to tell me something she had no obligation to share at all. I have spent years surrounded by men who tell me precisely what they believe I wish to hear, calculating their words for advantage before they ever open their mouths. This girl calculated nothing. She simply told me the truth as she understood it, and accepted whatever consequences might follow. That kind of honesty is rare enough that I find myself unwilling to dismiss it, however unusual its source. Brother Aldous smiled faintly. Then we shall discover tomorrow, my lord, whether her courage was well placed. While this conversation unfolded behind closed doors, Grace was finishing her evening duties in the common room, unaware of the exact words being exchanged above her, but sustained, somehow, by the simple knowledge that the plan was moving forward, that tomorrow would bring answers one way or another. It was as she carried a final tray of empty cups toward the kitchen that Nathaniel Vale intercepted her in the narrow hallway outside the pantry, stepping out from the shadows so suddenly that she nearly dropped everything she carried. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice pleasant, though something beneath it had gone hard and cold. "A moment of your time, if you would be so generous." Grace's heart slammed against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his eyes to keep her voice steady. "I have work to finish, sir." "This will only take a moment." He glanced past her shoulder, confirming the hallway was empty, and stepped closer, close enough that she caught the faint scent of wine on his breath, close enough that his height suddenly felt less like ordinary tallness and more like a deliberate, looming presence. "I noticed you speaking with a monk earlier today, or rather, I noticed you watching him with a great deal more interest than a passing traveler would usually inspire. I only wondered at the strange sight, sir. A monk arriving in such a hurry. Did you?" His smile did not waver, but his eyes had gone flat and assessing, the eyes of a man carefully weighing a threat. "You know, I have traveled a great deal in my work, Miss Whitmore. I have learned to notice small things. The way a person's hands move when they are nervous. The particular quality of silence that comes just before someone chooses their next lie carefully. And I noticed last night lights in the garden rather late, around the very hour the Duke is known to take his evening walk." Grace forced herself not to look away, though every instinct screamed at her to retreat. "I fetched water, sir, as I told you this morning." "Of course." He studied her a moment longer, and then, unexpectedly, his voice softened into something almost gentle, almost kind, a tone far more unsettling than his earlier coldness had been. "You seem like a clever girl, Miss Whitmore, clever enough to understand that a tavern maid's life can be comfortable or difficult, depending on circumstances entirely outside her control. Positions can be lost, references can be withheld. Or, alternatively, small kindnesses can be shown to those who understand the value of minding their own affairs, and leaving matters of diplomacy to those better suited to handle them." Grace understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what he was offering, and exactly what he was threatening beneath the pleasant phrasing. She thought of her grandfather again, of every quiet evening he had spent teaching her a language he believed might someday matter, and found, to her own surprise, that her fear was slowly giving way to something steadier, something closer to anger. "I don't know what you believe I have done, sir," she said, keeping her voice carefully even, "but I have only ever done my work here honestly, and I intend to continue doing so. If you have concerns about diplomacy, I would suggest you take them up with the Duke's household, rather than with a serving girl who has neither the power nor the inclination to interfere in matters far beyond her station." For a long, tense moment, Vale simply looked at her, and Grace could not tell whether her words had reassured him or confirmed whatever suspicions had brought him into this hallway in the first place. Finally, he stepped back, his pleasant smile returning as though it had never wavered. "Of course, forgive me, Miss Whitmore. A man grows overly cautious in the days before an important signing. I meant no offense." He inclined his head slightly and moved past her, disappearing down the hallway toward the stairs, leaving Grace standing alone with her heart still pounding and her hands. She realized only now, trembling badly enough that the cups on her tray rattled softly against each other. She made her way to the kitchen on unsteady legs, set the tray down carefully, and gripped the edge of the wash basin exactly as she had the day before, breathing hard, trying to steady the storm inside her chest. Vale suspected her. He might not know precisely what she had done, or precisely what the Duke was planning for tomorrow, but he suspected enough to threaten her directly, and a man willing to threaten a tavern maid the night before an important signing was a man who understood, at some level, exactly how much danger he was truly in. Grace found Peter later that evening near the stables and relayed the encounter in a low, urgent whisper. The boy's face grew pale as he listened. "You need to tell the Duke," he said immediately. "Tonight, if you can manage it. I don't know if I can risk being seen approaching him again. If Vale is watching me closely enough to notice lights in a garden, he'll certainly notice if I try to reach the Duke's chambers directly." Peter thought for a moment, his young face set with unusual seriousness. "I'll take a message myself, then. I can move through the household without drawing the kind of attention you would. Tell me exactly what he said, and I'll make sure the Duke hears every word before the signing begins tomorrow." Grace repeated the conversation as precisely as she could remember it, watching the boy's expression darken further with each detail. When she finished, he nodded once, firmly, the nervous uncertainty from their earlier conversations replaced by something steadier, something that reminded her, oddly, of her own resolve the night she had first decided to speak to the Duke at all. "I'll make sure he knows," Peter promised. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you won't be facing it without anyone else knowing the risk you've taken." That night Grace lay awake once again, listening to the sounds of the tavern settling into an uneasy quiet around her, replaying the hallway encounter over and over in her mind, searching for any detail she might have missed, any sign of exactly how much danger tomorrow might truly hold. Somewhere above her, she knew, a duke and a monk had finalized a plan built on trust in a stranger's word. Somewhere below her, or perhaps in the room just down the hall, a translator who had built his career on careful deception now understood, with growing certainty, that his carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel. Tomorrow, all of it would come to a single moment, a single reading of terms in a crowded hall, a single ring either resting quietly on a monk's finger or removed, and placed deliberately upon a table. Grace closed her eyes, though sleep remained far out of reach, and waited for the morning that would decide everything. The signing hall had once been the tavern's largest storage room, cleared and swept and dressed with borrowed tapestries until it resembled, at least from a distance, a space fitting for a ceremony of such importance. Long tables had been arranged at the front, one bearing the parchment copies of the agreement, another set for the Duke and his advisors, a third for the visiting merchants and their delegation. Chairs lined the walls for the gathered witnesses, town officials, curious merchants, and a scattering of ordinary townsfolk who had talked their way inside to witness history in the making. Grace was not meant to be present at all. Servants had no place in such a gathering, and any excuse to linger near the hall would have drawn exactly the kind of attention she could not afford. Instead, she found reasons to move through the corridor just outside, carrying linens that did not need carrying, checking supplies that had already been checked, positioning herself close enough to hear what she could through the partially open door, while appearing, to anyone who glanced her way, entirely occupied with ordinary tavern business. Inside the hall, Duke Edmund Castleton took his seat at the head table, dressed in formal attire that made him look every bit the powerful nobleman Grace had glimpsed only in passing before their strange midnight conversation in the garden. Beside him sat Roland Pike, still entirely unaware, as far as Grace could tell, of everything that had unfolded over the past 2 days. Behind them, seated modestly among the witnesses in plain brown robes that drew no particular attention, sat Brother Aldous, his hands folded calmly in his lap, a simple silver ring visible on his left hand. The merchant delegation entered next, led by a dignified older man named Hassan al-Farid, whose careful, measured bearing suggested a lifetime spent in careful negotiation. Behind him came several other merchants, including, Grace realized with a fresh jolt of tension, the 2 men whose conversation had started this entire ordeal 3 nights earlier. And finally, taking his position beside the Duke, exactly where he had stood through every stage of these negotiations, came Nathaniel Vale, composed, elegant, radiating the calm confidence of a man entirely in control of the proceedings about to unfold. Grace pressed herself against the wall just outside the door, her pulse hammering, and waited. The ceremony began formally, with greetings exchanged between the Duke and Hassan al-Farid, translated smoothly by Vale in both directions, his voice carrying easily through the hall. Grace listened carefully, comparing every phrase against her memory of Arabic she had learned so many years ago, and found nothing amiss in these opening pleasantries, exactly as she had expected. The true test would come later, when the actual terms of the agreement were read aloud for final confirmation before the signatures were exchanged. The formal reading began perhaps 20 minutes later, after the pleasantries had concluded and the parchment copies were brought forward and laid upon the central table. Duke Edmund rose, and in a clear, formal voice, began reading the terms of the agreement aloud in English, pausing after each clause for Vale to render the meaning into Arabic for the benefit of the merchant delegation. Grace listened, her whole body tense, straining to catch every word that carried through the partially open door. The early clauses passed without incident. Matters of grain shipments, wool quantities, timelines for delivery, translated smoothly and, as far as Grace could tell, accurately. She began to wonder, with a sinking feeling of dread entirely separate from her earlier fears, whether Vale had somehow altered his plans, whether her warning to the Duke and Peter's message about the hallway confrontation had spooked him into abandoning his scheme entirely, choosing honesty at the last possible moment rather than risk exposure. Then the Duke reached the clause concerning the river. The agreement grants the merchant delegation river access along the northern boundary, Duke Edmund read, his voice steady, for the purposes of transporting goods between the coastal ports and the inland trading routes. Grace held her breath. Vale turned to the merchant delegation and began translating, his voice smooth, unhurried, exactly as confident as it had been through every previous clause. But the words that left his mouth, Grace realized with a cold shock that ran through her entire body, were not the words the Duke had spoken. He was granting them ownership, not access. A subtle shift, a single word changed for another that carried an entirely different legal weight, spoken so smoothly, so naturally, that anyone without her particular knowledge would never have noticed the substitution at all. Across the hall, seated quietly among the witnesses, Brother Aldous reached up with his right hand, and with the small, deliberate motion the Duke had asked for, slipped the silver ring from his left finger and set it gently upon the table before him. Duke Edmund, who had been watching for exactly this signal throughout the entire reading, felt his stomach drop even as he kept his expression carefully neutral. He continued reading the next clause as though nothing had happened, giving no outward sign that anything was amiss, while his mind raced through the confirmation he had both hoped for and dreaded. Grace was wrong about nothing. Vale had been lying precisely as she described from the very beginning. The Duke finished the remaining clauses with the same outward calm, though every word now felt different in his mouth, heavier, more dangerous, knowing that beside him stood a man who had been quietly rewriting the terms of England's future relationship with an entire trading nation for his own private gain. When the final clause had been read and translated, Duke Edmund set down the parchment and looked around the hall, his gaze deliberately unhurried, giving nothing away. "Before we proceed to signatures," he said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room, "I believe it would be proper to confirm that both parties fully understand and agree with the terms as read. Master Al-Farid, might I trouble you to have your own copy read aloud as well, so that we may compare it directly against mine, for the sake of absolute clarity in an agreement of such significance." A ripple of confusion passed through the merchant delegation. Hassan Al-Farid glanced toward Vale, then back toward the Duke, clearly uncertain why such an unusual step was necessary at this late stage. "My lord, surely your own translator's rendering has been sufficient. This request is somewhat unusual for a ceremony already so far along." "Indulge me," the Duke said pleasantly, though something in his tone had shifted subtly enough that only those paying very close attention would have noticed the change. "I find that important agreements benefit from careful confirmation. It will only take a moment." There was little Hassan Al-Farid could do but comply, though Grace, watching through the gap in the door, noticed Vale's posture had gone rigid, his composed expression tightening almost imperceptibly at the edges. One of the merchants brought forward their own copy of the agreement, and at Hassan's nod began reading it aloud in Arabic. The moment the words left the merchant's mouth, describing river ownership in plain, unmistakable terms rather than mere access, a heavy silence fell across the hall. Duke Edmund, who understood not a word of Arabic himself, watched Brother Aldous instead, and saw the monk give a single, small, unmistakable nod. "There is a discrepancy, my lord," Brother Aldous said, rising from his seat among the witnesses, his quiet scholar's voice suddenly carrying enormous weight in the tense silence of the hall. "The clause just read grants ownership of the river, not merely access, as your translator rendered it moments ago. I studied for many years in Damascus, my lord, and I am confident in this distinction. The words are not the same, and the difference between them is not a small one." Every head in the hall turned first toward Brother Aldous, then toward Nathaniel Vale, whose carefully maintained composure finally, visibly, began to crack. "This is absurd," Vale said quickly, his voice rising slightly, losing some of its usual smooth control. "A simple misunderstanding, nothing more. Translation is an imprecise art, as any scholar would tell you. I merely chose words that conveyed the practical meaning of the arrangement, rather than a rigid literal." "There is nothing imprecise," Brother Aldous interrupted calmly, "about the difference between granting a right of passage and granting ownership of land. These are not similar concepts rendered slightly differently. They are opposite outcomes, and you rendered one as though it were the other, in front of a room full of witnesses who trusted you to render the truth." Duke Edmund rose slowly from his seat, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the pleasant formality it had held moments before. "Master Vale, I would ask you to explain yourself clearly, and I would strongly advise honesty, given that we now have independent confirmation of exactly what was said and what was not." Vale's eyes darted around the hall, taking in the sea of watching faces, the merchants exchanging uneasy glances among themselves. Hassan al-Farid's expression shifting from confusion to dawning, furious understanding, as he realized the trap his own delegation had unknowingly helped set for themselves. For a long moment, it seemed as though Vale might attempt some final, desperate explanation, some clever twist of words that had served him so well throughout his career. Instead, his gaze fell upon the doorway where Grace stood frozen, no longer bothering to hide her presence, watching the scene unfold with her heart pounding against her ribs. Understanding crossed his face, cold and complete, as he finally recognized exactly how this trap had been built, and exactly who had built the first, quiet piece of it 3 nights earlier in a corner of the tavern's common room. "You," he said, his voice low and venomous, all pretense of pleasant composure finally abandoned. "The serving girl." The hall erupted into startled murmurs, every eye now turning toward Grace, who stood in the doorway with nowhere left to hide, her secret finally, completely exposed in front of the very people whose trust and safety it had been meant to protect. For a long, terrible moment, the entire hall seemed frozen, every face turned toward the doorway where Grace stood exposed, her heart pounding so violently she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. She had imagined this moment a dozen different ways during her sleepless nights, but never quite like this, never with quite so many eyes fixed upon her all at once, never with Nathaniel Vale's cold fury directed so completely in her direction. "Yes," Grace said, forcing her voice to carry despite the tremor threatening to creep into it. She stepped fully into the hall, no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be occupied with ordinary tavern business. "I understand Arabic. I overheard your conversations, sir, both with the merchants 3 nights ago and again yesterday. I told the Duke what I heard because I believed it was the truth, and because I could not stand aside and watch 2 peoples build an agreement on a foundation of deliberate lies." Vale's composure, already badly cracked, seemed to shatter entirely. "This is outrageous. A serving girl's word taken over that of a trained diplomat with years of experience and impeccable references. My lord, surely you cannot allow—" "I allowed nothing based on her word alone," Duke Edmund interrupted, his voice sharp with an authority that silenced the hall immediately. "I allowed a test, Master Vale, precisely because her word alone was not sufficient proof for a matter of this importance. That test has now been completed, in front of a room full of witnesses, using your own careless confidence against you. Brother Aldous confirmed the discrepancy independently. The merchant's own copy, read aloud at your delegation's insistence, confirmed it further. You are not being condemned on a servant's accusation, Master Vale. You are being condemned by your own words, spoken in this very room moments ago." Hassan al-Farid rose from his seat, his expression a complicated mixture of anger and mortification, his gaze moving between Vale and the 2 merchants who had first been overheard in the tavern days earlier. "My lord, I give you my word on behalf of my delegation that this deception was not sanctioned by the leadership of our trading house. If certain members of my own party conspired with your translator for personal gain, they acted entirely outside their authority, and they will answer for it upon our return." The 2 merchants in question, recognized now by their pale, stricken expressions, had gone very still in their seats, clearly understanding that whatever scheme they had believed themselves clever enough to execute had collapsed completely around them. One of them, the older man with the gray beard Grace remembered from that first overheard conversation, rose slowly, his voice trembling. "My lord, I beg you to understand. It was Vale who approached us first, weeks ago, before your delegation ever arrived in this town. He offered to shade certain terms in our favor, in exchange for a share of the profits once the river trade began flowing under our control. We were foolish enough to believe such an arrangement could remain hidden forever." "You were foolish enough," Duke Edmund said coldly, "to believe that theft dressed in careful words remains anything other than theft. Whatever punishment your own delegation deems appropriate for your part in this, I trust Master Al-Farid will see it carried out. As for you, Master Vale, the Duke's guards, who had been standing at ease near the hall's entrance throughout the ceremony, moved forward at a small gesture from Roland Pike, who had finally grasped, in the space of the past several minutes, the full scope of what had nearly happened under his own careless dismissal 3 days earlier. Vale's eyes darted toward the door, toward the windows, searching for some route of escape that did not exist, surrounded as he was by witnesses, guards, and the ruins of a scheme that had taken far more careful planning than a single moment of panic could undo. You will be held, Duke Edmund continued, until proper authorities can determine the full extent of your deception, and whether this scheme extended to your previous negotiations as well. I find myself now questioning every agreement you have ever claimed to translate honestly on my behalf, and I intend to have each of them reviewed. Vale's face went pale at the implication, the realization dawning that this exposure would not remain contained to a single failed agreement, but would likely unravel years of carefully built reputation and quietly stolen advantage across every negotiation he had ever touched. The guards took hold of his arms, and though he opened his mouth as though to offer some final defense, no words came, only a bitter, defeated silence as he was led from the hall. The room remained tense and murmuring long after Vale's departure, the assembled witnesses processing what they had just seen, the merchants exchanging low, urgent conversations among themselves, town officials whispering behind raised hands. Grace remained standing near the doorway, uncertain whether she was meant to leave now that her role in the drama had concluded, or whether some further explanation was expected of her. Duke Edmund settled the matter by walking directly toward her, the entire hall watching, and inclining his head in a small, formal gesture that carried enormous weight given the audience observing it. "Grace Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet hall, 3 days ago, you came to me with a warning that many in your position would have kept silent, out of fear or simple self-preservation. I confess I did not fully believe you at first, though I respected the courage it took to speak at all. You have this day prevented what could have become a serious and lasting injury to the relationship between our two peoples, built instead on honest terms that both sides can trust. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks under the weight of so many watching eyes, but she held herself steady, remembering her grandfather's quiet lessons about standing firm even when the moment felt impossibly large. I only told you what I heard, my lord. The rest was your own doing, and Brother Aldous', and the careful trap you built together. Modesty becomes you, the Duke said, a faint smile touching his tired features for what seemed the first time in days. But it does not change the fact that none of it would have happened at all without your willingness to risk everything you had for the sake of a truth that was not even your own burden to carry. Hassan al-Farid approached as well, bowing slightly toward Grace with the formal courtesy of a man who understood exactly what her intervention had spared his own delegation from. On behalf of my people, I thank you as well, Miss Whitmore. Had this deception gone undiscovered, my own name and the reputation of my trading house would have been tied forever to a theft I never intended and never sanctioned. You have done us as great a service as you have done the Duke. Grace, unaccustomed to such formal gratitude from men so far above her ordinary station, found herself uncertain how to respond, and settled finally for a simple, sincere curtsy toward each of them in turn. I am glad, my lord, Master Al-Farid, that the truth came out before any harm was done that could not be undone. The hall began to empty slowly after that, the merchants withdrawing to discuss the revised terms of the agreement among themselves, town officials drifting away in small clusters, still murmuring about the extraordinary scene they had just witnessed. Roland Pike lingered near the Duke's table, his earlier dismissive confidence entirely gone, replaced by the uncomfortable awkwardness of a man who understood he had very nearly allowed a terrible mistake to proceed unchallenged out of simple, careless pride. "My lord," he said quietly, once most of the hall had cleared, "I owe the girl an apology, I think, for how quickly I turned her away." "You do," Duke Edmund agreed, though not unkindly. See that it is offered properly, Roland, and see that it is remembered the next time someone beneath your notice tries to tell you something you would rather not hear." Grace, overhearing this exchange as she gathered herself to return to her ordinary duties, felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight and anxious for 3 long days. Whatever came next, whatever changes this strange, frightening ordeal might bring to her quiet life at the tavern, the truth had finally been heard, believed, and acted upon, and the agreement that would shape the future of 2 trading nations would now be built on honest ground rather than carefully hidden lies. She turned to leave the hall, her thoughts already drifting toward the ordinary work still waiting for her in the kitchen, when Duke Edmund's voice stopped her one final time. "Grace Whitmore, do not disappear back into the kitchen just yet. I believe there remains one more matter to discuss between us, and it cannot wait until tomorrow." Grace turned back, her curiosity outweighing the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones over the past 3 sleepless days. The hall stood nearly empty now, only Duke Edmund, Roland Pike, and Brother Aldous remaining, along with a handful of guards stationed quietly near the doorway. "My lord." Duke Edmund gestured toward a chair near the head table, an invitation that made Grace hesitate, uncertain whether a tavern maid was truly meant to sit in the same space where such important negotiations had just concluded. Seeing her hesitation, the Duke's expression softened slightly. "Please, you have earned the right to sit, at the very least, after everything you have endured on my behalf these past few days." Grace lowered herself carefully into the offered chair, still half expecting some final complication to arise, some unforeseen consequence of her involvement that had not yet made itself known. Instead, the Duke studied her for a long moment with an expression she could not quite read, before finally speaking. "I have been considering, since our conversation in the garden, what a fitting response to your actions might look like. A simple reward of coin seems inadequate, given what you risked, though I intend to offer that as well. But I find myself wondering whether coin alone truly addresses the larger question your courage has raised for me." "My lord, I don't understand." "You speak Arabic fluently enough to catch a trained diplomat in a lie he believed undetectable," the Duke continued. "You possess, evidently, a natural gift for languages, along with a rare and valuable willingness to speak difficult truths even when doing so places you at considerable personal risk. These are not common qualities, Grace Whitmore, and I find myself reluctant to let such qualities return quietly to pouring ale and clearing tables, however honorable that work may be." Grace's breath caught, uncertain where this conversation was heading, though a small, cautious hope had begun stirring somewhere beneath her exhaustion. "What are you suggesting, my lord?" "I am suggesting a position within my household, as a liaison for matters requiring language and careful judgment, working alongside whatever translators I employ going forward, ensuring that what happened these past days can never happen again without swift detection. It would mean leaving this tavern, and likely this town as well, to travel with my household as negotiations require. It would mean a very different life than the one you have known." The offer hung in the air between them, enormous and unexpected, far beyond anything Grace had allowed herself to imagine even in her most hopeful moments over the past 3 days. She thought of Walter Higgins, who had employed her fairly and treated her kindly since her grandfather's death left her alone in the world. She thought of the small room above the kitchen that had been her only home for years. And she thought, too, of the strange, frightening, exhilarating days just past, the way speaking the truth had mattered more than she ever expected it could, the way a single decision to step forward had changed the course of an agreement affecting hundreds of people she would never meet. "My lord," she said slowly, "I am deeply grateful for the offer, and I do not say this lightly. But might I ask what such a position would actually require of me? I have never traveled beyond this town in my life. I know nothing of formal diplomacy beyond what I witnessed these past few days." "Diplomacy can be taught," Duke Edmund said. "Judgment, honesty, and courage cannot be taught nearly so easily, and you have already demonstrated all 3 in abundance. I would provide proper instruction, proper compensation, and proper protection for the risks such work might occasionally involve. What I cannot provide is a guarantee that the life would be easy or entirely safe. Diplomacy, as you have now seen firsthand, sometimes carries real danger alongside its rewards. Brother Aldous, who had remained quietly seated through this exchange, spoke up gently. "If I may offer a scholar's perspective, my lord, a gift for languages such as this young woman clearly possesses is rare enough that it deserves cultivation, not neglect. I would be glad, if it were helpful, to offer some instruction myself before continuing my own journey back to the monastery, to ensure her understanding of formal Arabic matches the fluency she already carries from more casual conversation." Grace looked between the Duke and the monk, the weight of the decision settling over her slowly, thoroughly, in a way that felt entirely different from the frantic urgency of the past 3 days. This was not a moment requiring immediate courage in the face of danger. This was a quieter choice, but no less significant, one that would shape the entire remainder of her life depending on which path she chose. "My lord," she said finally, "I would like to accept your offer, though I would ask for a small measure of time to settle my affairs here, and to speak properly with Master Higgins, who has been kind to me since my grandfather passed. I would not want to leave him short-handed without warning, after everything he has done for me." "That seems entirely reasonable," the Duke agreed. "Take whatever time is needed. My household will not depart for at least a week, given the additional negotiations still required to properly revise the agreement's terms following today's revelations. That should provide ample opportunity for proper farewells." Word of the day's events spread through the town with remarkable speed, as such stories always do in small places where little truly stays private for long. By evening, when Grace returned to the tavern's common room to help with the dinner service, she found herself the subject of curious, admiring glances from guests and townsfolk alike, several of whom approached her table service with questions she had no idea how to answer gracefully. "Is it true," one elderly woman asked, leaning forward with undisguised curiosity, "that you caught the Duke's own translator lying to his face, right there in front of everyone?" "I only told the Duke what I overheard," Grace said, feeling her cheeks warm under the attention. "The rest was his own doing." "Nonsense," Walter Higgins interjected from behind the bar, unable to hide the note of pride creeping into his gruff voice. "This girl's been serving drinks in my tavern for years, quiet as anything, and turns out she's been hiding a gift for languages and more courage than half the guards in this town put together. I always said there was more to her than met the eye." Grace shot him a grateful, slightly embarrassed look, and busied herself with the evening's work, though the strange, warm feeling of being seen, truly seen, after years of quiet, unremarkable service, settled into her chest alongside the exhaustion of the past several days. Later that evening, once the tavern had quieted and most of the guests had retired for the night, Grace found Walter alone by the fire, counting the day's earnings with the careful, methodical attention he brought to every task. "I wanted to speak with you," she began, "about the Duke's offer." Walter did not look up immediately from his counting, though his hand stilled briefly on the coins before him. "I heard already. News travels fast in a place this small, girl. I haven't decided anything final yet. I wanted to speak with you first before I gave the Duke my answer." Now Walter did look up, his weathered face carrying an expression Grace had rarely seen from him, something gentler than his usual brisk practicality. "You've been a good worker here, Grace, ever since your grandfather passed and left you with nothing but this town and a few coins to your name. I'd be sorry to lose you, I won't pretend otherwise. But I'd be a poor sort of friend if I told you to stay here pouring ale for the rest of your days, when a duke himself is offering you a chance most folks in this town could never even dream of." "You're not angry." "Angry?" Walter shook his head slowly. "Girl, you spoke up when speaking up could have cost you everything, and it turned out you were right and brave enough to be believed. That's not something to be angry about. That's something to be proud of, and I am whatever comes next for you." He paused, then added, with a gruffness that did not quite hide the emotion beneath it, "Just promise me you'll write, once you've learned your letters well enough for it, and that you'll visit when your travels bring you back this way." "I promise," Grace said, feeling her throat tighten unexpectedly at his kindness. Over the following days, as the revised trade agreement was carefully renegotiated under much closer scrutiny than the original had received, Grace found herself spending long hours with Brother Aldous, who proved to be a patient and thorough teacher, helping her understand not just the conversational Arabic her grandfather had taught her, but the more formal language required for genuine diplomatic work. She learned, too, from observing the careful, methodical way the Duke's household now approached every clause of the new agreement, cross-checking translations, inviting multiple independent scholars to review the terms before any signature was finally exchanged. Nathaniel Vale, she learned through Peter's careful gathering of household gossip, had been transferred to proper authorities for formal judgment, his years of previous negotiations now under thorough review by officials determined to uncover the full extent of his deceptions. The two merchants who had conspired with him faced their own consequences at the hands of Hassan al-Farid's trading house, a swift and thorough reckoning that left little doubt among the wider merchant community that such schemes would not be tolerated going forward. The revised agreement, finally signed a full week after the original ceremony, granted river access exactly as intended, with ownership remaining clearly, unambiguously with the Duke's territory, translated this time by 3 independent scholars working together, cross-checking every clause with a thoroughness that left no room for the kind of quiet deception Vale had so nearly gotten away with. The signing ceremony itself was smaller, quieter, lacking the grand formality of the first attempt, but carrying a weight of genuine trust that the earlier version, Grace now understood, had never truly possessed. On the morning of her departure with the Duke's household, Grace stood in the tavern's small courtyard, her few belongings gathered into a single modest bag, saying farewell to Walter Higgins and the small handful of other staff who had become, over her years working there, something close to family. Peter, who had been offered a position in the household's expanded traveling staff, as thanks for his own quiet courage in carrying messages during those tense, dangerous days, stood waiting nearby with an excitement he could barely contain. "Ready?" he asked, as Grace finished her final embrace with Walter. "As ready as I'll ever be," she admitted, glancing back once more at the tavern that had been her entire world for so many years, the familiar stone walls and worn wooden sign now holding a strange new significance as the place where everything had changed. She climbed into the waiting carriage alongside Brother Aldous, who had agreed to continue her instruction during the early stages of the household's travels before eventually returning to his monastery, and looked out the window one final time as the carriage began to move, watching the tavern, and the only life she had ever known, slowly disappear behind her. Ahead lay a future she could not have imagined even a week earlier, filled with new languages to master, new negotiations to navigate, and quite possibly new dangers to face, given how narrowly the last one had been avoided. But she carried with her, too, the steady, quiet confidence that had carried her through those frightening days, the certainty that speaking the truth, however difficult, however risky, was always worth the cost of staying silent. Somewhere behind her, in the town she was leaving, life would continue much as it always had, ale poured, plates cleared, ordinary days moving steadily forward. But the agreement she had helped protect would ripple outward for years to come, shaping trade and trust between two peoples in ways she would likely never fully witness, all because a tavern maid had chosen, on one ordinary evening, to trust her own understanding over her own fear. The carriage rolled forward along the northern road, carrying Grace Whitmore toward a future built entirely on the courage of a single, difficult truth, finally spoken aloud when it mattered most. 6 months passed before Grace found herself standing in a negotiation hall again, though this time the circumstances could not have been more different from that first frightening ceremony at the Gilded Anchor. She stood now not near a doorway, hidden and uncertain of her place, but seated openly at a long table beside Duke Edmund Castleton, wearing the plain but well-made clothing of a household official, her role in the proceedings acknowledged by everyone present rather than hidden in the shadows. The months since her departure had passed in a blur of learning. Brother Aldous had continued her instruction for nearly 2 months before returning to his monastery, leaving her with a foundation in formal Arabic far beyond what her grandfather had ever taught her, along with a habit of careful, patient study that she applied to every new challenge the Duke's household presented. She had learned the particular language of trade agreements, the specific vocabulary of land grants and shipping rights and tariff arrangements, until words that had once seemed impossibly foreign now felt as familiar as the simple kitchen conversations of her childhood. She had also learned, more gradually, the particular skills of diplomacy itself, the careful reading of a room, the ability to sense when a pause in conversation carried more weight than the words spoken before or after it, the patience required to let a difficult moment breathe rather than rushing to fill silence with unnecessary words. Roland Pike, true to the Duke's instruction, had become something of an unlikely mentor in these matters. His initial dismissiveness toward her replaced over time by a grudging, then genuine respect for how quickly she absorbed the formal expectations of household diplomacy. This new negotiation, taking place in a coastal city considerably larger than the small town Grace had left behind, concerned a fishing agreement between the Duke's territory and a delegation from a distant port, whose language was neither English nor Arabic, but a dialect of Portuguese that none of the Duke's usual translators spoke with any confidence. Grace herself had spent the past 6 weeks studying the language intensively, working alongside a hired tutor recommended by Brother Aldous, determined to be useful in whatever capacity the Duke's household required of her. She was not, on this occasion, the sole safeguard against deception. The Duke's household had adopted, following the events at the Gilded Anchor, a standing policy of never relying on a single translator for any agreement of significant value, always ensuring at least 2 independent voices verified the terms before any signature was exchanged. Grace served now as one such voice, though her particular value lay not only in her growing fluency across several languages, but in the sharp, careful attention she brought to every clause, every phrase, every small choice of wording that might carry more weight than it first appeared to hold. The fishing agreement proceeded smoothly, without any hint of the deception that had nearly derailed the earlier trade deal, though Grace found herself watching every translator's face with the same careful attention she had once turned on Nathaniel Vale, a habit she suspected she would carry with her for the rest of her career. When the final terms were read and confirmed by all parties, and the signatures were finally exchanged, she felt a quiet satisfaction entirely different from the frantic relief of that first dramatic exposure, a steadier, more settled sense of work done properly and well. Afterward, as the negotiation hall emptied and the celebratory dinner began to be arranged for the visiting delegation, Duke Edmund found a quiet moment to speak with her privately, much as he had in the tavern garden so many months before. "You have adapted to this life more thoroughly than I expected," he said, watching the preparations unfold around them. "When I made you that offer, I confess I worried you might find the demands of household service, the travel, the constant negotiation, too great a change from the quiet life you had known." "I worried about that too, my lord, in the early days," Grace admitted. "But I found that the skills mattered more than the setting, listening carefully, speaking honestly, noticing what others might miss. Those things stayed the same, whether I was serving ale in a small tavern or sitting at a negotiating table in a foreign port." A wise observation. The Duke studied her for a moment, the same careful, assessing look she remembered from their first strange conversation in the garden, though it carried a warmth now that had been absent in that earlier, uncertain meeting. "I have been considering expanding your role further, given how well you have managed these past months. There is discussion among my council of establishing a small office dedicated entirely to verifying the accuracy of translations across all significant agreements, not merely those I personally negotiate, but those undertaken by allied households as well. Such an office would require someone with genuine expertise, careful judgment, and an unshakable commitment to honesty over convenience. I find myself with only one candidate in mind for leading such an effort. Grace felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement, not unlike the fear that had gripped her that first night in the tavern garden, though tempered now by 6 months of hard-won confidence. My lord, I would be honored to take on such responsibility, though I would want to ensure it is built properly, with clear standards that could outlast any single person's involvement, myself included. What happened with Vale should never be possible again, in any household, under any circumstances. Precisely the response I hoped for, the Duke said, a genuine smile crossing his tired features. We shall discuss the particulars in the coming weeks, once we have returned home. For now, I believe a celebratory dinner awaits, and I suspect our hosts would be disappointed if their newest trusted translator failed to attend. Grace smiled and followed him toward the gathering crowd, her thoughts drifting briefly, as they often did in quiet moments, to the small tavern she had left behind, to Walter Higgins and his gruff kindness, to the narrow room above the kitchen where she had spent so many ordinary years before one extraordinary evening changed the entire course of her life. She had kept her promise to write, sending letters whenever her travels allowed, each one filled with news of distant cities and unfamiliar languages that would have seemed impossible to imagine during her years pouring ale in that quiet corner of England. She thought, too, sometimes, of Nathaniel Vale, whose formal judgment had concluded months earlier with a sentence that stripped him of his position and reputation entirely. His years of careful, hidden deceptions across multiple negotiations finally brought fully into the light through the thorough investigation the Duke had ordered. She felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet certainty that the truth, however long delayed, had finally caught up with the lies he had built his career upon, and that the trust broken by his actions was slowly, carefully being rebuilt through the more rigorous standards now guiding every agreement the Duke's household undertook. Peter, too, had flourished in his expanded role within the traveling household, his quiet courage during those tense days at the tavern having marked him, in the Duke's eyes, as someone worth investing in further. He had begun his own studies alongside Grace, determined to develop skills beyond simple errand running, driven by an ambition that had first stirred. He confessed to her once, during the frightening excitement of carrying secret messages between a tavern maid and a duke on the eve of an important signing. As the celebratory dinner began that evening, filled with unfamiliar dishes and careful, respectful conversation flowing smoothly between English, Arabic, and Portuguese, thanks to the careful work of several translators working in careful concert rather than dangerous isolation, Grace found herself reflecting on how completely her life had transformed since that first overheard conversation in the corner of a small English tavern. She had been then an unremarkable serving girl with a secret skill she had never expected to need, uncertain whether speaking up would ruin her life or simply pass unnoticed by anyone powerful enough to matter. She understood now, sitting at a table of honored guests in a foreign port city, that the moment she chose to speak had not been small at all, however ordinary it had felt at the time, standing frozen with a jug of ale halfway to a table, listening to words that were never meant for her understanding. Sometimes, she thought, the most important moments in a life arrive disguised as ordinary ones, easy to walk past, easy to ignore, easy to convince oneself were not truly one's business to address. She had learned through fear and risk and the steady support of people who chose in the end to believe her, that the harder path of speaking honestly, however frightening, however uncertain its outcome, was almost always the path worth choosing. The dinner continued late into the evening, filled with laughter and careful diplomacy, and the particular satisfaction of an agreement built honestly from its very foundation. Grace Whitmore, once a quiet tavern maid whose only inheritance had been a language taught by a patient grandfather, and a stubborn refusal to stay silent when silence would have been so much easier, sat among diplomats and dukes and foreign delegations, no longer hidden in doorways or shadows, but seated firmly and rightfully at the table where important truths were spoken, heard, and honored. Her grandfather, she thought, watching the warm candlelight flicker across the gathered faces, would have been proud beyond words to see exactly where his quiet evening lessons had finally led.